All in. Where's Kathy? Is Kathy here? Okay. One announcement that I did not make in the other room, I wanted to make in here. The Garden Community Church is currently celebrating its 125th year anniversary. And SMCHA offers its congratulations to the Garden Church, which of course is the home of many of the descendants of the different Swiss Mennonite groups. And Kathy is going to tell us a little more.
Garden Community Church is located about halfway between Moundridge and Halstead on the Halstead Road, for those of you who don't know. The majority of the first members were from several churches in Bavaria and Germany and migrated to America in 1851 and 1859. They settled first in Iowa and Illinois, and in 1874 migrated to Kansas. The first church was established in Halstead, Kansas in 1875. Later, the First Mennonite Church of Christian in Moundridge, Kansas was organized from members of the Halstead Church. It had been the desire of a number of the families living in the Garden Township for a place to worship, since it was so far to go to Halstead or Moundridge for services. The means of travel was with horses or mules hitched to a lumber wagon. On grounds of driving distance, the group from the Garden Township area came from both of these churches. In 1887, about 15 families met in Liberty Schoolhouse to undertake organizing a church. A constitution was drawn up and a committee elected to solicit funds and to find a place to erect a building, which was 26 feet by 37 feet. And we have a picture of that little church. The land was donated by Katie Crable of Halstead. The next year, the church was dedicated with 51 members. This was the beginning of the little church at Garden. In 1898, a year later, the church was too small to accommodate all of its members, and 16 feet was added. Soon after, Sunday school was organized, and the Ladies' Sewing Society, which continues to meet the needs of missionaries, and the homeless shelter in Newton. In the early 1900s, the Garden Church, with the Halstead, First Christian, and West Zion churches were co-owners of the Hertzler Hospital in Halstead, and 160 acres of land south of Halstead known as the Lysy Orphan Society. Here's a little tidbit. Until 1923, all church services were in German. 63 years later, in 1951, groundbreaking services were held for a new church building with a full basement and kitchen, 39 by 70 feet, with a cost of approximately $26,000. 20 years later came an addition to the south. 5 years later, an addition to the north for a library, classrooms, and enlarged kitchen. 11 years later, 1987, an addition to the east to support the growing Awana program and other needs. The church offices are on Main Street in Heston, used also for youth meetings and some Bible studies. Garden Church has a strong missions program presently supporting 5 couples on foreign soil and 4 couples in the United States. Gary Jansen is the current pastor, and average attendance is about 170. The Garden Church purpose statement sets 3 goals: to glorify God, edify and build up one another toward Christ-like maturity, and involve ourselves in worldwide evangelism. Congratulations to the people of Garden Community Church for their faithfulness to God through 125 years.
It was interesting to me, since of course I grew up in the Moundridge area, as many of you know, and my wife grew up in the First Mennonite Church of Christian, and she always talked about the fact that, we're not Schweitzer, we're Swiss. And when we were in the Weierhof here a month or so ago, I talked to Gary Waltner, and I said, her name is Gable. And he said, oh, we've got them here. Well, there aren't any Gables left, but they're in the cemetery. And so it was interesting to me. They spell a G-O with an umlaut, B-E-L, and when it came over here, it was spelled as Gable. Well, the interesting thing, to me at least, goes a step farther, in that the Weierhof is also the home of the Crable family. And I don't recall the guy's first name, but there was a Crable who homesteaded in the Weierhof, and he had two sons. And as happened so often, there wasn't enough land for both of them, and so one of them moved a few miles down the road to a place called the Primmerhof. And the Crables that went to the Primmerhof, and I have Crable descendants or Crable background. The Crable who went into the Primmerhof were the Crables whose families then went up through the Palatinate and into Germany and so on, and up Poland and Ukraine. The Crables who stayed in the Weierhof are the people who came to Illinois and Ohio and places like that, and then to Halstead. So there were Crables in both cases. We all share the same DNA, I think, but we had a different route here. That's just my 2 cents worth. As we go to the various churches, one of the things we try to find out a little bit about is the church, the history and so on of the church. It helps us, I think, to understand who it is that we are and where our people are attending. And of course, the Whitestone Church, just as I said earlier, this is the first time we've been here, and but a variety of persons with a Swiss background attend here. And so we've asked John Sharp to tell us a little bit about the church here. And so, John, it's your turn.
Good evening. Go back in time with me to March 3, 1885. Jacob and Leah Erb and their 4 children, Tillman, Annie, Mary, and Susie, boarded the train at the Mount Joy station, Mount Joy, Pennsylvania, on the western end of Lancaster County. As one of them said, then they sailed for the broad acres of Kansas. The Erbs became the principal founding family of this congregation and provided 3 generations of leaders to this congregation, the conference, and the wider church. 19-year-old Tillman, who became the primary founder of Heston College, kept a diary. And he wrote that when they left the Mount Joy station, there were so many people there to see them off. And when they got to Harrisburg, there were so many more. By that time, he said, there were about 500 people on the train going to points in the West. Jacob and Leah had explored Kansas the spring before, along with 50 other prospective immigrants from Lancaster County. They were impressed by what they saw. From Peabody, they explored various directions, looking for good land. Ephraim N. Nisley, one of those who were on this trek, said he was pleased with the good roads and perfect weather. This was March, remember. And he wrote, "We passed through a perfect sea of land, the prairie and grass fields all clothed in the green robe made a grand sight. As we came on south, we passed through the grazing country. One field we passed over contained 35,000 acres. Remember, they were coming from 80-acre farms in Pennsylvania. They couldn't believe their eyes. The Erbs went back home and put Leah's ancestral farm on auction. When I was doing the Heston College history, I wanted to see the farms they left when they moved to Kansas. The Erb farm is still impressive. A very large stone-gabled barn and a very large house, two-sided house, big enough for two families. Very impressive. They sold that on auction, and the bidding started at $110 an acre, and it was, as he said, knocked off at $135. The price for the price was $11,475 for 85 acres. And that was lower than the other farms that had gone on auction that summer, and they were a bit disappointed. Jacob and Leah bought a farm, 80 acres, actually 2 quarter sections, northwest of Newton, for an average of $34.74 per acre. Remember what they got for the farm in Pennsylvania? $100 more in Pennsylvania than here. One good reason for moving to Kansas. The new farm was located on the southeast corner of what is now Meridian Road and 24th Street, Newton. On Sunday, they went to meeting, as they called church, in a crowded schoolhouse at Truesdale. Did you know Zimmerdale was called Truesdale at once upon a time? Father Daniel Brundage, pioneer organizer of congregations and conferences in the Old West of old Mennonite congregations, preached the sermon that day. This congregation was the last of 4 congregations under the bishop's care in what I call the Brundage Circuit. Spring Valley near Canton was founded in 1873, the first Mennonite church in Kansas. Catlin was next at Peabody in 1876. West Liberty near Windham followed in 1880, and finally this one in 1885. The next week, September 26, 1885, the congregation, as they always put it, made a preacher and a deacon. This was done by lot, of course. The lot fell on David Weaver, a Lancaster County immigrant, and Jacob Erb was ordained deacon. And for the first time, they served communion. Though not everyone was from Pennsylvania, the majority of the settlers were, and actually they were all from Lancaster County, most of them. They thought they should name this congregation the Pennsylvania Church, which they did. Now, of course, there were others from Ohio and Maryland and Illinois. When a woman from Maryland complained, nobody paid her much attention because the decision really had been made already. The names of the Lancaster County origin were Bear, Buckwalter, Hess, Horst, Landis, Longenecker, Martin, Weaver, and Zimmerman, and the link to Lancaster County is unmistakable. If you've ever noticed the Heston City signs, you find Lancaster, Erb, Hess, Weaver, and Charles, straight out of Lancaster County. When talk of a college in the West led to the founding of an academy, Heston proved the most attractive location of 6, largely because of the thriving Pennsylvania church nearby, and its leading minister, Tillman, by then T.M. Erb. Whitestone has been noted for a number of things. One landmark is July 1950. The idea for Mennonite disaster service was born during a Sunday school class picnic. The civilian public service experience led to the concern for ongoing service and how were they going to do this and what were they going to do. Along with Heston Mennonite Church, they organized the Mennonite Service Organization, which in 1956 became MDS, Mennonite Disaster Service. The congregation has also been known for the large number of mission workers and pastors. By 1964, the congregation had ordained or commissioned 15 missionaries, 20 ministers, and 20 city mission workers. Also that year, the congregation's missional call led to a relocation away from its isolated rural home to the city of Heston with its many opportunities for outreach. By this time, the congregation had lost its attachment to Pennsylvania and renamed itself for the stone facade that you see on the outside, Whitestone. More recently, the congregation under Kurt Horst's leadership has rekindled its missional passion and launched an unusual kind of a mission extension to those in Heston or around who are the least likely to enter a Mennonite church or any church at all. They hired and commissioned Ron Moyo to be its evangelist pastor. Ron is a graduate of the Pastoral Ministries program at Heston and also a recent immigrant refugee from Zimbabwe. When he was working with MCC there, he was advised to leave because his work for the poor and the hungry was considered subversive. So he found asylum here in this country. That's your introduction to Whitestone, and there are other members here who can answer all of your questions, I'm sure.
Thank you, John. Appreciate it. As you know, we, SMCHA, almost immediately after it was born, started sponsoring trips, tours to the homeland of the ancestors. I think it was born in about 1973, and I think the first trip was in 73. This past July and August, after an 18-year break, SMCHA sponsored the Heritage Tour through parts of Europe and the Ukraine. For many people, this proved to be quite a memorable experience. At least one person said that it was the most significant thing that had happened in their life to date. Helen Nachtigall is here to tell you briefly about the highlights of the trip. Helen, as you know, is the person who pretty much was the brains behind the tour. She put it all together. She did the hours of hard work. And so she's going to tell us a little bit about what the trip meant to her. Helen, where are you?
After months, no, maybe years of planning, the Swiss Mennonite Heritage Tour actually became a reality this past summer. And I think everyone that was on this trip, and I see a lot of you here, would agree it was a wonderful excursion. Now, Laverne asked me to condense 16 days of travel to 5 minutes, and I will attempt to do that miracle. We had 39 travelers from various places, including Canada, Minnesota, Washington, Kansas, Pennsylvania, Oklahoma, Texas, South Dakota, and California. A very diverse group, all with common roots. And on these bus trips, there was much comparing of lineage and where you came from and who was related to who. And I think we were all related. Our tour took us to the Netherlands, Germany, Ukraine, Poland, France, and Switzerland. Gary Waltner, who I know many of you know, was our tour guide for most of the trip, and he made the arrangements for the European side of this trip. Gary has been living in Germany since he graduated from Bethel, a native of Freeman, and now he is the main librarian at the Mennonite Historical Library in Weierhof, Germany. In addition, excuse me, we had guides that traveled with us mostly in the Ukraine and Poland, and they could speak the Ukrainian language, which was very helpful as we went into these villages and tried to connect with local folks there. Our travel throughout the trip was mainly by bus, but we did have a couple of airline transfers. Our favorite guide was a gentleman named Anatoly Penner, who had some Mennonite history in his background. He was a delightful guide, and everyone on the trip felt a special connection to him. I was going to mention I said we had 39 travelers. The ages were somewhere, the youngest I think was about 47, and I believe the oldest was Lloyd Gehring. In trying to decide what kind of highlights I could come up with to share, I couldn't come up with just a few because there were so many. In the Netherlands, we visited the Anne Frank House, we saw the windmills in operation, we saw wooden shoe demonstrations, and in the Netherlands, in Amsterdam, we visited the hidden Mennonite church. And we found out it was really hidden because some of us got lost. But at that time, Mennonites and others were considered radicals, and only the state church was allowed to have steeples or bells or anything that would designate them as a church. Others had to be hidden. So in this building, the front entrance just looked like a regular building, a shop or a school or anything like that. So when we opened the door, you just went down a hallway, and then you opened another door, and then you saw this big auditorium sanctuary, and someone compared it to the Eden sanctuary. And that church is, in fact, still in use today as a Mennonite church. We also visited a memorial to Menno Simons, Ehrlich Zwingli, and other Anabaptist early leaders. And we're just amazed at Gary Waltner, the amount of information he has stored in his head. He knew all the dates of all these historical events, all the places. It was just amazing. Many of us had never been to the Cologne Cathedral, and we were amazed at the size and the beauty of that. I do believe, however, that for many on this trip, the main desire was to step foot on holy soil where their ancestors once lived. And we were not disappointed. Our guides had done their homework, and they had studied legal documents and pinpointed by coordinates exactly where these Mennonite villages used to be. Now, the names are all different now, but they still had it all figured out. And we visited the sites of Edwardsdorf, Kodasufka, Horadish, and Waldheim, and others. And here we saw villages much as they probably were in the days when Harley Stuckey took tours. Agriculture seemed to be the same as about 100 years ago, with horses doing the fields, very, very little mechanized equipment. We encountered horse-drawn wagons as the main mode of transportation, but we did see some of those people had cell phones. Frequently, we saw horses or cows graze. This is in the Ukraine now, grazing right alongside the road. They were either attended by someone just watching them, or they were hobbled together. Their front legs were tied with ropes to each other so that they couldn't move very far or get onto the road. As far as tangible evidence of the Mennonite villages of our ancestors, basically there was none. We encountered some elderly residents who said that perhaps their parents had told them that somewhere back there used to be some Germans who lived back there. But whether those were the Mennonite Germans or the Lutheran Germans who bought some of the homes from the Mennonites when they left, we do not know. But anyway, it was a spiritual experience to step on the soil where we knew for sure our ancestors had lived. We spent some time visiting the Mennonite community at Weierhof, where Gary Waltner lives, and is the librarian there for the Mennonite Historical Library. As Laverne said, in the cemetery there, we saw grave memorials with many Swiss names, such as Stuckey, Zerger, Graber, but these were of a later period than when our ancestors settled there. We visited the Mennonite church in Weierhof and a number of other Mennonite churches on our travels. Gary invited us to his home, which was very special, and some of us responded to his invitation to sample his homemade schnapps. A sample is all we needed. In France, we visited the Montbéliard Mennonite Church, where we saw the baptismal records of 1753, and I noted the signature of Mosey Geering, spelled G-E-R-I-N-G, who is somewhere in the lineage of a number of us. Following this, we went to the home of a Graber family, and this family is doing genealogical work of tracing the families of the area, including the Grabers, Kaufmans, Gehrings, and so on. And we also went to, Laverne mentioned the Crabels. We did go to a place where there was one remaining Crable ancestor by the name of Frederick Crable. I don't remember a whole lot more about it. We visited the Traxelwald Castle prison where the Anabaptists were held when they were hunted down by the Anabaptist hunters, and we saw the cells with the iron shackles. It was really a very dismal place. We also attended church in Langnau, Switzerland, one of the oldest Baptist churches in the world. Every morning we began with devotions and sometimes a little reminiscing about our travels. We sang old German hymns provided to us by Kathy Gehring. We also had fun during our bus travels. Laverne and I were the resident joke tellers, and by unanimous opinion, my jokes were the best. There is much more to tell, but he limited me to 5 minutes, and I think there will be many opportunities later to hear more details about our trip that really was quite extraordinary. We did have much interest in this trip, and we do have a waiting list of people who wanted to go. So if anyone here wants to organize another trip, I will give you the list of the names and maybe even a few suggestions about the next trip.
I think unanimous opinion is in the eyes of the beholder. As Helen said, it was quite an extraordinary experience, and we could talk a long time about it. The one thing that I've been asked a number of times, and Helen sort of alluded to this, and that is, are you going to do it again? There were people on the list who didn't get to go because the trip was full. There were people who didn't sign up because they knew it was full but asked about it. There have been people who have asked about going again since we're back home that hadn't asked earlier. So I think the question probably is, there's always a possibility. Helen's raring to do it again. That it could happen in a year or two if there's interest, like the summer of 2014 or something like that. No decision has been made, but if there's interest, I'm sure that there'll be people who are willing to work on it. So if you're interested in doing this, if you think you'd like to do a trip like this, let us know. And because if there are enough people who are interested, why we might try it again. Tonight would be a good time to start. The last trip filled up. We announced it, and it filled up in just no time. I think we announced it about in September or something, and it was full and just almost immediately. So I don't know if that'll happen again or not, but if you're interested, get your name on the list. There's no obligation, it's just an indication of interest. This evening, we need to present a person who's no stranger to this area, Ivan White. Ivan White grew up in the Peabody area. He had strong ties to Heston. His father, Alan, was an inventor and inventive genius, who worked for the Heston Corporation, which is, of course, now AGCO, and then he passed those innovative genes on to his sons. One of those sons, Ivan, of course, has been involved in a variety of things. He's built homes, he's been a school teacher, and he's developed a relationship with a friend he calls Otis. in recent years, he's done more visiting with groups about Otis. Now, Ivan, I'm not sure if you're lucky enough to have any Swiss blood coursing through your veins, but I can tell you that in a manner of speaking, you're related to us because members of your family are buried in the same cemetery, including your father, as the children who we buried there in 1874 and who were the children of our immigrant ancestors. And so, Ivan, we claim you as one of us. So, Ivan, are you here? Yeah, there you are. Please help me welcome Ivan White and his friend Otis.
Thank you. It's a privilege to be here. I have to tell you in the first place that Greg Clausen gave a little 5-minute ventriloquist thing when I was teaching at Berean Academy. I was sitting in the back with the other teachers and I thought, wow, what if I could learn to do that? Well, I found out how you learn to be a ventriloquist. One of the best ways, Greg even told me this, is to take a handful of marbles and you put them in your mouth and you try to talk. And each day you get a little better so you can take one marble out, and when you've lost all your marbles, you're a ventriloquist. So we'll get Otis and see what happens. Well, how you doing? Well, okay. Wow. What is this? Well, this is actually a lot of these people are Swiss Mennonites. They sure are. It didn't take them long to eat, and they got in here right away. No, they're Swiss Mennonites, not Swift Mennonites. Oh, what are Swiss Mennonites? We'll talk about it after the program. Okay. Do they like history? I think they do. Well, they're going to learn some history from me. Really? Yeah? You remember we had a program out in a park in a little town? Yeah, that's right. I learned how that town got its name. Really? Yeah? There was a man, he was a mayor, his name was Theodore. Yeah? Well, what happened? Well, he fell off his tractor and got hurt really bad. Could never walk again. They took him around in the wheelbarrow. Really? Yeah, they were going to call the town Theodore Town, and that didn't work very well. So they were going to call it Wheelbarrow Town, and that didn't work very well either. And somebody said, "Well, call it what the wheelbarrow does." So they just called it Halstead. I see. Okay. Well, Otis, how you doing? You go to school? Yes, I do. Do you like school? Do I like school? Not very well. Well, why not? Do you like your teacher? Not too good. What's your teacher's name? Her name is Miss Rathburn. She got plenty of both of those. Really? Yeah, she made me stand in the corner for something I didn't even do. Made you stand in the corner for something you didn't do? Yeah. What didn't you do? I didn't do my lesson? Oh, I see. Well, Otis, tonight, in front of all these people, I really hope you have a little bit of a change of heart. What are you talking about? Well, I kind of want you to behave and to be kind of a good boy. I'll be good if you give me a quarter. Otis, when I was your age, I didn't have to have a quarter to be good. Yeah, I know. When you were my age, you were good for nothing, Otis. Think you know all the answers. I'll tell you what, I'm going to give you a riddle. Okay, I like riddles. All right. Any farmers here? Any of you ever live on a farm? How many? Well, looky there. Well, they're going to understand this riddle because it's about crows. Okay, now pay attention. I'm listening. There were 3 crows sitting on a fence. 3 crows sitting on a fence. And if I shoot one of them, what'd you do that for? It's just a riddle. I didn't shoot one. It's just a riddle, Otis. Now pay attention. 3 crows are sitting on a fence. 3 crows sitting on a fence. If I shoot one, how many are left? 3 crows sitting on 1, 2, 3. 2 left. Well, I don't think you know crows very well. Now listen again. 3 crows are sitting on a fence. 3 crows sitting on a fence. If I shoot one, you shoot, you nasty guy. If I shoot one, how many are left? 2 left. Otis, yeah? I don't think you understand crows at all. If I shoot one of them, the other 2 would fly away. That's what I've been trying to tell you. 2 left. Oh. Okay. I got a riddle for you. You've got a riddle for me? Yes, I do. And for anyone out here that has never heard it before, okay. What is your riddle? It's about music. About music? Well, sort of. Okay, go ahead. What key of music is it when a piano falls down a mine shaft? What key of music is it when a piano falls down a mine shaft? Does anybody know? I don't have any idea. What key would it be? Well, it would be A flat minor. Yeah, I guess it would. Well, okay, is there anything else you want to do? I would like to sing a song. You would like to sing a song? Okay, go ahead. Are you ready? No? Well, why not? I got to clear my throat. Well, clear your throat. Every day with Jesus is sweeter than the day before. Let me tell you, every day with Jesus, I love him more and more and more and more and more. Go on. Jesus saves and keeps me, yeah, and he's the one I'm waiting. Go on. Waiting for. Every day with Jesus is sweeter than the day, sweeter than the day, sweeter than the day before. Yeah. Well, that was different. I never heard you sing it like that. Yeah, I know. We learned in Sunday school class to do stuff like that. What do you mean in Sunday school class? Well, in Psalm 96, it reads, "Sing a new song to the Lord." So I sang a new song. Oh, okay. So that's supposed to be good, huh? Well, it's different and it's more fun than the same old boring way. Yeah. So God wants us to sing a new song. Well, okay, but what if somebody doesn't know how to sing? No, it's not just about music. It's about your whole life. Do things in a new, different way. Don't get all boring. Oh, well, that makes sense. Yeah, pretty good idea, Otis. I kind of like that. I think we ought to tell a story about you and Grandma in the garden. Oh, that's embarrassing. I think we should tell it. I'm going to need my wife's help. She'll come up here. Actually, though, Otis, before we do that, you said you didn't like school very well. Yeah. What's your best part of school? I like art. You like art in school? Yes, I do. And so you're talking about regular school or Sunday school? Sunday school. Sound like that better than that old Miss Rathburn. Okay. And so, well, what was your art thing in Sunday school? Well, we learned about Adam and Eve and the first stuff that happened, so I drew a picture. Yeah, you can come on up here, Twyla. You can show them the picture even. It's the first one back there. Bring it out here. Right, that cardboard. This is the story, the meaning of the story of Adam and Eve. Well, I don't understand. Well, that's God driving Adam and Eve out of the garden. Okay. Well, let's get to your story about the garden. It's not this garden. No, it wasn't that garden for sure. Oh, first I want to tell you about this car. Is that what we're seeing there? Okay. This is a story about a little kid, kind of like me, in a big city. He was walking, and he saw this car. Wow, really cool. Okay. He looked at it. He wiped his hand along it. It was black. Doesn't look black there, but it was black, shiny, really nice. And a man came. You can be him. Okay. Well, Sonny, how are you? Okay. Mister, is this your car? Yes, this is my car. Wow, it's really nice. Well, I enjoy it. Well, where did you get that car? Well, actually, my brother gave it to me. Your brother gave it to you? Wow. I wish I could be a brother like that. Okay. You could back up just a little so I can be sure to see it. How come you got to see it? It's my story. That's all right, Otis. Okay. Well, in the first place, Grandpa got out his rototiller and tilled up the soil. And then Grandma, she helped me. We used a hoe and a couple of stakes and a string and made nice straight rows. She gave me a stick and a bunch of seeds. She said, plant these seeds the distance of this stick in each row. And I'm going to go back in the house, Otis, and you finish the job. Well, I got tired after a while, and I started thinking about my new Tonka truck. So, you know what I did? I just tossed all the seeds in one place, covered them up quick. I figured nobody will ever find out. Then, not yet. Then we went home from Grandma's, or we went to Grandma's on a vacation for about a week and a half. And when we came back, and I woke up in the morning and looked out of my window, I hollered, Mom, there's a turtle in my garden. And she said, Otis, I don't think it's a turtle. Let's go look. We looked. You can guess what it was. All those seeds growing up kind of looked like a turtle, but it sure wasn't. Why was I in trouble? I had something they call consequences. You had something they call consequences. Yeah, I think most of these guys know about some of that. Some of them know a lot more than others. Okay. What were the consequences? Well, I couldn't play with my truck for a whole month. Well, is there a lesson to this story? Yes, there is. Every one of us, God gives a garden. Some kind of a garden to work in, to tend, to plant in, to have things grow. Not just seeds and flowers and stuff like that. Each of us have a different garden. Sometimes it changes all through our lives. But we get distracted by things like Tonka trucks. Some of them are real Tonka trucks. Well, that's a pretty good story, Otis. Thank you. Okay. Well, so what's next? Well, I think you go back in your box. I gotta go back it stinks in there. I don't want to go back in my box. I think it's time to. Well, just a minute. There was a man, I heard a man talking before I came out here. He was John Sharp. Yeah, I think John Sharp is here. He's right over here on the corner. That's John Sharp? Well, yeah. You know that guy? Well, sure I do. He's a friend of mine. You're kidding. No, I'm not kidding. Well, look at him. Well, yeah. Well, there's something wrong with that guy. There is nothing wrong with John. Yes, there is. And when I thought, I know what it is. What is it? He's ugly! Otis, John is not ugly. Good grief. Now here you are making embarrassments to the whole crowd and to John and to me, to yourself. You tell John you're sorry. I what? You apologize and tell John you're sorry. In front of all these folks? Yes. You got in trouble in front of all of them. Now tell him you're sorry. John, I can't do it. Yes, you can. Otis, hurry up. People are waiting. Some of them are almost asleep. Really? No. Tell him you're sorry. John, I'm sorry you're so ugly. That's enough, Otis. It's not my fault. Yes, it's your fault. No, it's not. Not all my fault. What do you mean it's not all your fault? You had a hand in it.
Well, maybe we'll have some more riddles yet here coming from David. David Ortman lives in Seattle, Washington, with his wife Ann Marchin, formerly of Wichita. He grew up in the rural Marion-Freeman area of South Dakota. He graduated from Freeman Academy, Freedom Junior College, and Bethel College. Got to be a good guy. He was a Mennonite voluntary service worker for 5 years with Friends of the Earth in Seattle, Washington, and Washington, D.C. Then worked as a paid staffer for Friends of the Earth for a total of 22 years. He took the Washington State Bar exam in 2006, and as an attorney, helps write land use decisions for local governments around Puget Sound. He also says he meddles in Mennonite history. When I wrote about him in Schweitzer Salt, several people rebuked me saying, "You forgot a whole big piece about David, all of his athletic prowess." So I asked him about that, and he said, yes, he ran track at high school and junior college and at Bethel, and he remembered Vic Gehring coming to see him at the Bethel track meets. Now he got to see him today again. He was at the National Senior Games for over 50 crowd, which are held every 2 years in July in Cleveland, Ohio, and he won the men's 60-64 long jump, 17 feet 5.5 inches, oh my. And he took second in the high jump, 5 feet 1 3/4 inches. Let's see who else could do that. And he won the 400 meter in 56.78. I guess that's not hours, it must be seconds, huh? So I have talked with David on the phone several times and found him intriguing, and know that he has a lot to say about research in Mennonite history and Mennonite topics. So we welcome you, David. Look forward to your words. Let's welcome David Ortman.
Thank you, Kathy. That was a very kind introduction. And I've noticed as one grows older, the introductions begin to sound a bit more like obituaries. But with us tonight is my father, Delmer Ortman, from the Marion area of South Dakota, my sister, Jane Ortman Dietrich, from Chapman, Kansas, and also a Heston graduate. And earlier tonight, my daughter, Nia Ortman, was here from Seattle, and we wanted to thank the association for their scholarship in 2011 that helped her go to Burkina Faso in West Africa through the MCC SALT program, where she taught English for a year there. I also bring you greetings from the Seattle Mennonite Church. Most of you have not visited us, but it is great to be here amongst family, third, fourth, fifth, sixth cousins, second, third, fourth times removed, and who know what all that means. But you can't get too far away. As mentioned, after graduating from Bethel, I went to Seattle and worked for Friends of the Earth of Mennonite Voluntary Service Program, mostly working on federal legislation. But I got a call one afternoon from someone at the Seattle City Council who wanted me to come down on a tour because Seattle was considering a garbage incinerator, and they thought that perhaps I might have some views, which I, of course, always do. And So we flew with some of the Seattle City Council members down to Portland, and I didn't really know all that much about the Seattle City Council because that really wasn't the area I worked in a lot. But I sat down next to one of the women City Council members. And she turned to me and said, "I know who you are." Well, and, you know, I'd been in Seattle long enough that that probably wasn't unusual. And then she said, "You're from Bethel College." And I said, well, I thought, you know, there's 3 Bethel colleges, and so maybe she's confused, or, you know, how would she know that? But then she said, "Well, I'm married to Kurt Galley from Mound Ridge." So this was Virginia Galley, our Seattle City Council, who had connections back here and had made those with me. And as you know, traveling, you run into all sorts of people and you start conversations. And somewhere you wind up perhaps talking about, oh yes, Mennonites, and sometimes you can see their wheels starting to spin, thinking, you know, Mormons, Moonies, Mennonites, you know, what is all this? Well, I heard about a Baptist and a Catholic and a Mennonite who were going to an ecumenical conference, and they were traveling and had a very bad, tragic car accident. They all died. Showed up at the pearly gates. St. Peter was there, and he says, "Oh, we didn't expect you this soon. Your rooms aren't ready, but let me see what I can do." So St. Peter goes off and he calls Satan. He comes back and says, "Oh, Satan has some spare rooms just temporarily. It's okay. You can go and we'll get your rooms ready." Well, an hour later, Satan calls St. Peter back and says, "You have to come get these guys. The Baptist is baptizing everyone, the Catholic is forgiving everyone, and this Mennonite is organizing something called Mennonite Voluntary Service." So, you know, that's the way that goes. We are going to do a little time travel, Schweitzer style tonight. We'll try and wrap this up by 9. And if you're interested, there's a sign-up sheet there. I can email this to you, so you don't have to take notes. We're going to see if the technology works. Yes, there we go. And because most of the Schweitzers came from Russia to cross the ocean and came to the Midwest, I have brought a little memento from Russia with me. This is a piece of the Chelyabinsk meteorite that you may have seen splashing across the sky in February of this year. There were a number of pieces that were found, and these are now available. And I thought it would be interesting to bring here for the Russian Swiss Mennonites who came here something else from Russia, a visitor from outer space. They calculate that this meteor was probably about 4.5 billion years old. You know, we start off talking about our Mennonite stories. We usually start with 1525, Conrad Grebel, Switzerland, Zurich, all that. And really, we go back a whole lot further with time than that. In fact, they now think that if you have a gold wedding ring or a gold jewelry of some sort, that gold was formed by the collision of 2 neutron stars. You think about that, that puts some of our little history and our little history books in some sort of perspective. One of the other areas that's now been more interesting has been the genetic testing that you can do by sending off saliva into kits. So I did this just to see what would happen, and there's controversy in the genealogy circles about whether you can show that, you know, cousin Charles is really related to that cousin Norman over there, and trying to solve all that. But what it showed was there's not all that surprising actually. I turn out to be 99.8% European, which of course is pretty much accurate because that's where it came from. No Native American DNA, no African DNA. But what was interesting was there is a 2.8% of the DNA is Neanderthal, which some of my classmates like Brian Stuckey probably suspected when we were running hurdles at Bethel together. But I bet none of you on your genealogy tree have way up there any Neanderthals listed. But you go back 40,000 years, and it turns out the Neanderthals were living in Europe. In fact, they were living in Switzerland. There's prehistoric caves that have Neanderthal relics in parts of Appenzell in Switzerland. And so again, just a reminder that our history does not start from 1525. In fact, if you think about it, if we had ancestors in Switzerland in 1525, well, they must have been there for quite some time. And of course, the Swiss history is something we don't always spend a lot of time looking at either. Switzerland during the Roman period looked something like this. And it's interesting to go back and find out that Switzerland was first conquered by the Romans, at least the southern part, around 200 some BC. They actually formed some coalitions with some tribes and defeated the Romans in about 107 BC. And they were finally beaten by Caesar in a battle in 58 BC. So maybe our ancestors in Switzerland were at one time fighting Julius Caesar. I mean, that's kind of interesting. You know, it didn't all start at 1525. So, as we say, more research is needed to find out what things were going to happen. All right, so let's go to 1525. You look at Luke 12:51. Suppose ye that I have come to give peace on earth. I say nay, but rather division. Well, that must be the Mennonite motto, because we are the most divisive, schismatic group of churchgoers that there probably is on the planet. Just to show how this comes about, two of my great-great-great-grandfathers, the Schrogs and the Muellers, who were living in the German area at that time in France, moved to East Galicia in Austria around that 1785 period. And for some reason, they got interested in Hutterite colony, which was located in Russia. So they made some trips and spent about 6 months or so at this Hutterite colony in Washinka in Russia. Well, that did not turn out to be so much of a success. But what was interesting was this Schrog and Miller families had been Amish, okay, when they were living there. They went to a Hutterite colony and then moved on to start up the Edwardsdorf, which some of you had been to in Volhynia. And although that says that they had 1825 had still signed the Amish agreements at that time, they sort of had lost that and converted to Mennonitism by 1861. So here in my background, I've got two families who, you know, Amish, Hutterites, and then Mennonites. So it all, you know, is very interesting to figure out. And because three of the Schrog sisters married Hutterites, there's apparently Hutterite cousins out there too I have to go talk to and find. Then we have those who stayed. You mentioned the Grabers earlier, and this may be a familiar story to most of you, where Christian Graber and Maria Roth were living in Montpellier, France. The 8 children, one died as an infant. The oldest daughter married a local Peter Eicher and stayed in France. 6 others married and made the migration from that area again to Austria and into Russia, and then ultimately to the Midwest. And of those 6 Graber children, Elizabeth, Christian, Johann, Peter, Daniel, and Jacob, I am directly descendant of all 6 children. Now, I don't know if that's a record. If you go back up your family tree, maybe that isn't so uncommon, but it does tell me that we need to get some new blood into the family. And so some of that happened. People, you know, often ask me, so where did the Ortmans come from? Well, we're not Swiss, and most of us didn't go to Russia. And the very brief history is that Ortmans were living in the Mecklenburg-Schwerin area of North Germany in the late 1700s. The Prussians, the Russians, and the Austrians divvied up poor Poland again, and one of the Prussian princes got some land and said, come farm in some of the, at that time they wouldn't call Germans, of course, but the German area went over there to settle some of that place around Kalisz in Poland. So there were 4 Ortman brothers who had wives and a sister who married an Ortman cousin to make things even more confusing. And they got into trouble as Lutherans. They came over as Lutherans, and they got into trouble because they had some difficulty with the adult baptism and infant baptism problems, and the Lutherans were baptizing and grabbing their kids, and someone said to them, you know, you're just like those stiff-necked Mennonites. And they said, well, what's a Mennonite? Oh, you know, they live in Russia. So the Ortman cousin and the sister went off to visit the Stucky Church in Kodostovka and decided that they were going to move there, and did just as they were all leaving Russia to come to the Midwest. So the 4 Ortman brothers in their families in Poland never got to Russia because it wouldn't do them any good, because all those people were going to the Midwest. So they snuck out of the country of Poland and wound up on a ship, the SS Westphalia, and came along with the crowd and began intermarriage and intermingling, and that is how those 4 Ortman brothers and their family got to South Dakota. The cousin and the sister who was in Russia didn't leave Russia until 1878, and then came to Mound Ridge. So that's why you have a branch of the Ortmans around Mound Ridge, Roland Ortman and others you may know, and then the Ortman clan up in South Dakota. Whoop. Oh, did I skip this? Let's see. Yes, and so we go to bank failures, which I'll get to, and you'll see why in a minute or so. So when the Mennonites came to Kansas and to South Dakota, we know of our own recent recession, we know about the Depression in the 1930s, but we oftentimes forget how many bank failures and what they called panics and problems of money and whatnot were happening when the Mennonites arrived. Starting with 1873, the Depression there cost approximately 3 million Americans to lose their jobs. The Depression lasted for 5 years, and so you can imagine trying to homestead and put things together and do anything with our new country when you had all of these bank failures and depressions that were popping up all the time. A couple of other things they found when they got here, of course, was 1874, and again, because we came to an area that had been, in essence, depopulated with the Native Americans being moved to reservations. We don't have as much association with those stories as they did in Pennsylvania and perhaps Ohio. And so one of the propositions I'd like to propose is that all Mennonite churches should have 2 signs. One, the name of the church, and beneath that says, this church is built on land once occupied by the whatever tribe was there. Tribes did not own the land as we know it, but there certainly were tribes that occupied this land where this church is, where the North and South Church is in South Dakota, Mound Ridge Church is, all throughout in Henderson. And I think it would provide some connection and recognition for the Native Americans that were here before us. And again, more research needed. When they came to the plains, it was only 70 years after Lewis and Clark had made their journey from St. Louis and up the Missouri, up to South Dakota, through Montana, all the way to the Pacific. In that short time period, what Lewis and Clark saw was a bountiful land that was pretty much untouched. And yet, within that 70-year time period, we had some of the greatest extinctions and near extinctions ever to have on the planet. That included, of course, the bison, of which at one time they think there were 60 million bison running from Canada all the way down to Texas. And the tall grass prairie, of course, which began immediately to be turned over and plowed. The passenger pigeon, of which they estimate 3 to 5 billion birds, of which there are no more. And another species that we know very little about because they were exterminated very soon was the Rocky Mountain locust, where they said one swarm perhaps had as many as 12.5 trillion insects that were driven over the edge to extinction. Derek Jensen recently wrote a little summary of some of this, and he says, "My great-grandmother grew up in a sod house in Nebraska. When she was a tiny girl, in other words, only 4 human generations ago, there were still enough wild bison on the plains that she was afraid lightning storms would spook them and they would trample their home. Who in Nebraska today worries about being trampled by bison? For that matter, who in Nebraska today even thinks about bison on a monthly or daily basis? Where have all the animals gone? It's hard to fight for what you don't know. You've lost." A February 2003 High Country News article, Jeffrey Lockwood wrote, "Picture swirling snow as far as the eyes can see in the middle of summer. Now, imagine this blizzard of flakes transforming into a swarm of locusts. This isn't just any swarm, but the largest concentration of animal life that the human race has ever known. Picture yourself at Plattsmouth, Nebraska in the summer of 1875, a year after 1874. A swarm of Rocky Mountain locusts streams overhead for 5 days, creating a living eclipse of the sun. It is a superorganism composed of 10 billion individuals devouring as much vegetation as a massive herd of bison. A metabolic wildfire that races across the Great Plains. It was estimated that the swarm was 1,800 miles long and at least 110 miles wide. The last swarm of Rocky Mountain locusts were between 1873 and 1877. And now they are all gone. And I mention this because as we look into the future about what the impacts of climate change may be, it's a reminder that catastrophic change can occur rather rapidly. Those 70 years were very cataclysmic for the bison, tallgrass prairie, the passenger pigeons, and the locusts. And those same things may happen again if we are not careful. Now, does this sound familiar? In 1870, a handful of men went to Kansas and returned a favorable report of homesteading possibilities. Several families migrated, and their assessments were also positive. In 1875, a board appointed several delegates to visit the West and report on conditions of settlement. One of them visited Kansas during the early summer of 1875 and reported his findings back to a meeting. And one estimate is that between 4,000 and 5,000 came to Kansas during the spring of 1879. I mean, that sounds pretty familiar. That does kind of sound like the Mennonite story, except this was not the Mennonites. These were black former slaves from Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas, and Tennessee, who were being terrorized by Southern whites, unwilling to accommodate to Reconstruction after the Civil War. These immigrants settled throughout Kansas, from Nicodemus, which is maybe something you're familiar with, to Dodge City, from Parsons to Fort Scott to Topeka, Leavenworth, and Atchison. In the Seattle University of Washington Library, I found this book called Exodusters, Black Migration to Kansas After Reconstruction. Very fascinating account of how blacks had the same experience of trying to find a home here in Kansas that the Mennonites did. And what's interesting is that there's a footnote on page 149 concerning a short-lived colony in Marion County. Maybe you know that there was, blacks who had a short colony in Marion County. It was news to me. More research needed, perhaps. Back-to-back failures. Now it's 1884, another panic. New York City banks were in trouble. They halted investments, all sorts of things. The banks in Pittsburgh failed. 10,000 small firms failed. So again, as the settlers were trying to settle the prairie, these things were happening. And then, of course, we had the blizzards. You may have read, and maybe David Laskin has been here. He's a Seattle author. I've met with him. He wrote this book, The Children's Blizzard. It's about the blizzard of 1888, in which our Half of the story is about Norwegian immigrants in South Dakota who had children and others who died, and then half the story is on the Schweitzers, the John Albrecht, Peter Graeber, John Henry, and Elias Kaufman, again, relatives of mine who were in a schoolhouse and did not make it home and froze to death. And one of the questions I have is, why does it take a Jewish author from Seattle to write a book about the Mennonites in 1888? He just said he found it such a compelling story. He said there was a later blizzard in March in 1988 that shut down New York City. And if he had written about that, the audience in New York City was a little bigger than the audience in the Midwest. But he was so fascinated by this that he wrote this book. And I'll get back to him later as well. More bank failures, 1890. Again, insolvency, London. And there were poor investments in Argentina. The whole global economy is starting to take shape. And so things that happen in Argentina are having an effect here. And 3 years later, we have more bank failures. 16,000 businesses had failed. 1 in 6 American men lost their jobs. And this one lasted for 4 years, ending in 1897. Although in 1896, we had another bank failure and a panic, and the stock market went down to, I don't suppose many of the Mennonite farmers here had 401ks or retirement plans, so maybe they weren't so concerned about the stock market. But that was the environment that the Mennonites found when they were here. And because of the conditions, some in South Dakota left. This is kind of a rare book, For His Sake by Mildred Schrock. She is one of the Schroggs from Oregon, from the family who moved from South Dakota in the late 1800s, primarily because Joseph Schrogg, who had come over from Russia, had cataracts and his eyesight was failing. The doctors that he went to out east said, this dust and everything in the Midwest is going to turn you blind, so you really need to go to a better climate. And so they headed for Oregon, and others followed. They were a little late. The Willamette Valley was sort of full, and someone said, there's a lot of empty land in eastern Washington. It looks like Kansas. There's no trees. It's hot. You can grow wheat. So a lot of them who had gone to Oregon hightailed it up to a place in Ritzville, and maybe you have been here. But what I wanted to point out, this is my parents on the left, Delmer and Maxine Ortman, at the Schrogg Safety Rest Area. This is actually rest stop number 198 on Interstate 90. And I don't know of any other rest stops in the country that are named after Schweitzers. So, more research needed. So we're going to also find that there were Mennonites who then went from Ritzville and the Schrogg area of central Washington to Monroe, Washington. And Monroe is just north of Seattle, and I had no idea that there were Mennonites up there, but sure enough, you go up there and you find a cemetery. And I just thought this was interesting. I printed it out because it's a little hard to read. But there's a Daniel Schrogg, or they called him their Schrags, born 1848 in Waldheim, Russia. So you think about it, and here's someone who was living in Russia, crossed Europe, crossed the Atlantic, crossed all of the United States, got to Monroe, Washington, almost made it all the way back to Russia. If he had just kept going, he'd have been back where he started. These people really went a long way. So amongst all these bank failures, what do Mennonites do? Well, you need to start a bank. I mean, that's obvious. You need credit, you need something. So in the midst of all this bank failure, 1902, the First National Bank of Freeman was formed. And there were original organizers were Joseph Graeber, Joseph Waltner, and his 3 brothers, who were also Waltners. But by January '03, some of them severed their connections and sold off to other stockholders, including my great-grandfather, John C. Miller. And they constructed a bank on the corner of 4th and Main and Freeman called the First National Bank. So great-grandfather Miller's involvement in the bank continued throughout his lifetime, and he was at one time president of the board of directors. And from the Bethel College Bulletin. This is a picture from the class of 1893 to 1894. My great-grandfather, John C. Miller, is the middle person in the front row. And going to Bethel from South Dakota was, of course, quite a privilege at that time. But I don't know as if he took any banking classes. You know, how do you become president of a bank? Would any of us at this time be capable of taking over a bank at a time when the banking crisis was going on like that? In fact, it's not only that was a problem, but the Freeman Courier runs a little reflections, and I was reading this one 75 years ago. This is from June 6, 1935. Just a little item. It says, "No bank robbery in Freeman all this week." Well, that's certainly good news. No bank robbery this week. So not only do you have the bank failures, you apparently got people trying to steal your money. And, of course, soon after they started the bank, what happened? There was more bank failures and panics, and someone tried to corner the market on copper. Does that sound familiar with what some of the Hunt brothers did on silver a while back? Oh, this stuff goes back centuries. So if we move in time a little bit to cover our time travel, we go to World War I. David Laskin, who wrote The Children's Blizzard, wrote another book. It's called The Long Way Home, in which he intertwines the story of immigrants who came from Europe. These were mostly, Italians and Polish and others who were trying to get away from the craziness of Europe, just like the Mennonites did, came over here, and even though they weren't citizens, World War I breaks out, they get drafted, and they get sent right back to Europe to fight their old countrymen. So David Laskin, again, who wrote The Children's Blizzard, has a major book on this and talks about how these immigrants who had come over were sent back and all their stories. But he also has a chapter in there about the Hutterites. And again, you're probably familiar with this story, at least to some extent, of 4 Hutterite brothers, or Hutterites from one of the colonies in South Dakota, who during World War I were also drafted. They were sent to Fort Lewis in Washington State to serve in the military, because there was no CO status at that time, and they simply refused. And as a result of their refusal, they were court-martialed at Fort Lewis in Washington and sent to 20 years hard labor at Alcatraz. And again, the story is probably familiar. All the things you read about Abu Ghraib and Iraq with military torture, that didn't start there. Military was doing that to its own citizens back in World War I with the Hutterites. They were water tortured, they were tied up, all this stuff is right out of that same old textbook. And they were transferred then to Fort Leavenworth here in Kansas in a weakened condition in winter, developed pneumonia, 3 of them died. I had a reporter friend who was interested in this story, and he actually went and obtained the transcripts of the court-martial of these Hutterites at Fort Lewis, this military tribunal, and out of the archives. And it's fascinating, and there's a link to some of this that I can provide. But what is also interesting was in reading through history that Marnette Ortman Hofer did on the Ortmans, my grandfather's brother, Henry Ortman, was also drafted in World War I. He was sent down here to Fort Riley, and he did not cooperate. And he wound up at the Fort Riley prison. Okay? Until I had read that in the history book that she somehow had gotten hold of. I had never heard that story. Never been talked about, no references. Even today, I talked to Norman Hofer, who's a historian up in Freeman, about these things. He says, yeah, that wasn't the only one, but nobody talked about it. Nobody wrote it down. Nobody, wants to think back about those times. Those were not the good times. And again, more research needed to cover these stories that we don't. And one of the tragedies is that, among other tragedies, the records that the military kept about Fort Riley and Fort Leavenworth were shipped to, I believe, St. Louis, which had a fire, couple of years ago, and many of those records burned, although it's not entirely clear in all that mayhem where these records were or whatnot. So as they say, more research needed. I just throw this picture in because it's interesting. This is a picture of a old farmhouse that's about a quarter mile to the east of our family Ortman farm in rural Marion area. And it was built by Zacharias Ewert, who married Roseanne Ortman. And of course now it's just a shell of itself. And I'm sure as you look around and drive around Marion County, McPherson County, and Turner County, Hutchinson County in South Dakota, you see these skeleton houses, and you think they must have a story because they're going to get bulldozed and turned into wheat fields and cornfields and sorghum fields. But I was thinking, just like how could someone become president of a bank with no banking classes? How do they build these houses? I had a little problem with plaster and lath in my old Seattle house, and started to scrape, and I realized I was in over my head, and you try and find someone who knows anything about plaster these days, it got sheetrocked, But to think about doing a house like that, plastering the lath, ceilings, with all of that overhead work, and building these houses, that is just almost a lost art. And what is happening to these old farmhouses is quite interesting. Doop. 1939, I came across this letter in, again, my great-grandfather's files as we were sorting through. And it's in German, and you don't need to read it, but I did blow up what was most interesting. This is a letter from Adolf Goering. If I remember my family tree, this would have been my great-grandmother's brother's wife's uncle. Okay, so the important thing to note here is the date and the place. Poland, I don't speak Polish. April 21, 1939. There's probably no place on the planet that was the worst place to be in 1939 than Poland. Okay? Someone who, stayed or was visiting or being in that environment. There's a lot of people, you go through James Crable books, and he goes through the Russian Mennonite immigrants, and you'll see a line that says, "This family stayed behind, not followed here," because he was following the ones who went. There were a lot who stayed. We know some of their stories, but not all of them. I mean, just think about that. 1939 to be in Poland. Bit of history there from that standpoint. And then we come to the next, I don't know, it always seems like we're always dealing with wars. Korean War came along. This had an impact on me because I was born in Bridgeport, Connecticut. And the reason I was born in Bridgeport, Connecticut was my father and mother were there. Makes sense. And they were part of 55 men who did alternate service, 1W service as it's called, during the Korean War. Again, not a terribly well-researched part because, you deal with World War II and that seems to be a lot of the emphasis. But when you're in grade school and you have to fill out a little form and they tell you, so where were you born? And everybody says Freeman, Marion. It could have been Lima, Ohio, would have been easier to spell. Bridgeport, and then Connecticut. And it didn't fit in the little space they give you. And so I became aware as a very early child that I had been born somewhere else and why that was. And I think it led to my interest in voluntary service and whatnot. This was 55 men who worked at the Fairfield State Hospital in Connecticut and did mental health work at a time in which they were still doing lobotomies and electric shock therapies and helped reinvigorate Mennonite interest in things like Prairie View and places like that. Just as a point of interest, I don't know if you're interested in watching movies, but there is a movie with Brad Pitt called Sleepers, in which was filmed at this place and under the tunnels. The movie isn't about the hospital, but the location is, if you want to get a sense of what those underground tunnels were like, very spooky at that time. And I believe that Frank DeFord, who is a famous sports illustrator, they took part of the Fairfield Hospital and converted it to the city of Newtown. This is a Newtown where the tragedy of shootings occurred not too long ago. This hospital is in Newtown, Connecticut. So they converted it into offices, and I believe he broadcast from that building. And then Rich Preheim did a very nice article in the Mennonite World Review about this back on March 4th. And I just throw this in. Were any of you intermittent trainees? You remember the program? Anybody? Yes, somebody went over there. I worked on 2 chicken farms, and now I can confess that the reason I did that during my junior year at Bethel was to get out of college German. And as a result, I came back with a farmer's vocabulary and a Schwäbisch dialect, Grüß Gott, which is not very handy when you're talking politics these days. The 2 places I was at was the Unterbiegelhof between Heidelberg and Heilbronn, which is the upper picture. And the reason I bring this in was because it was only years after I got back, that I find out that this turns out to have been a stopover place for a Swiss bishop by the name of Hans Herr. You may be familiar with that name because there's a Hans Herr house in Pennsylvania. He's recognized as sort of a very important leader of those who went to Pennsylvania directly instead of making the wrong turn to Russia. And he apparently stayed at the Unterbiegelhof, this place, for several months. And I had no idea. No one ever put up a little plaque saying, Hans Herr slept here. It's kind of a tongue twister, Hans Herr slept here. Again, if we don't record these little histories, it might have gotten me going on this a long time ago. The second place was done by Stuttgart, the Hagenauer Hof with the Heinrich Amen, and I got excited about that because, as you know, in all our family trees, there's these missing links, people who just kind of pop in, and turns out there's 2, and I guess it's Eyman sisters on the family tree. One married to Johann Zerger, and Zerger's here, maybe familiar with that, and the other one married Heinrich Müller, again, both relatives of mine. But there's no real information. And so, I got kind of excited thinking, well, maybe I was at this place. And then, of course, I finally noted that, well, the sisters were the Eymans and the Amens, and maybe that's different people, and that's how it is with this research. You try and find out as much as you can. So there's the trainee. The trainee program ended a couple of years ago. And I don't know, those records must be over in Europe, and maybe Gary can dig them out sometime, but I don't know if there's any record of all these trainees and where they are, so we could have little reunions and get together and contact about our wonderful trainee stories. And I just went past one of my slides, but that's okay because that one is talking about the next problem we had, which was, of course, the Vietnam War. And the 1960s and 70s were a tension time between voluntary service and alternate service, and I know some of us who went through that time period did quite a bit of, I sent off for a lot of information. I had a big box of things. I finally donated that to the Freeman Historical Library up in Freeman, and trying to get others of that era to see if they have any material from the Vietnam era. There was just a nice article that was in about the Martin Luther King speech with Dr. Dwight Platt, one of my professors, that I never knew he was there. Unless someone writes these things down, we never know exactly how these things will go. The last, there we are again, thank you. Yeah, wonderful drafting. So my last slide here to conclude, although with this business you never get conclusions, you just get more questions. I'd lived in Seattle about 10 years, and we moved to an area called Ballard, which is north of a little community neighborhood in Seattle, but call it Ballard. They have their own little post office and their shopping area and their library. So I went into the library, and above the desk was this very nice wooden sculpture. And I thought, that's very nice, and one day I kind of looked at it, and engraved underneath there, where I could finally see it when I poked my nose under it, it said Graber. Well, there's not too many Grabers in the world, so you gotta figure it's a relative. But, if it just says Graver, what are you gonna do? It wasn't until 10 years after that I got a letter from a woman from Montana who had married a Graber, who also had relatives from Freeman and the Zaft-Ortman side, and somehow knew that I knew something about this. And as we were comparing notes, she said, "Did you ever know my brother in Seattle?" "Who is your brother?" I said, "Archie Graber." "No, what did he do?" "He was a sculptor." "Oh, that's the Archie Graber who did this." So they tore down the Ballard Public Library with the decommissioned the sculpture, and they said they were going to put it into the new library. So when the new library opened up, I went down to look at it, and there's no sculpture. What happened to Archie's sculpture? And they said, well, we gave it to the Ballard High School. Okay, so I went over to the Ballard High School, and I said, "Do you have a sculpture from the library?" "Yeah, it's in the basement." "Oh," I said, "well, what's it doing down there?" "Well, we're just kind of waiting until we can get it mounted." And I kept checking back, and about a year later, lo and behold, there it is, mounted at Ballard Public Library. It's a big school, about 1,400 kids. Both our children went there. And this is my daughter, Nia, standing under Archie Graber's sculpture called the Trees of Knowledge. And she's the only person, I'm sure, in that whole school who's related to the sculpture, right? But if you didn't know these things, you'd never know it. And he also did some sculptures in Fairbanks and elsewhere. And again, I'm wondering if there's a way of, you have a Mennonite Your Way, books about staying with people. Do we have a Mennonite Your Way to artistic sculptures around the country done by Mennonites? I think it's time. More research needed. Well, that's our little time travel. Again, oftentimes raising more questions than we need. You don't need to take notes. If you want a copy of the PowerPoint, I've got a sign-up sheet. Just give me your email if you have one, or we'll figure out through Kathy how to get you a copy of notes. I'll also make a donation here to the Association of the Christian Miller and Anna Schrog, which my mother and I put together back in 2002, that details the migration of the Schrogs and Miller clan through the Hutterite colonies and on to Russia, which is pretty interesting. So I thank you very much for your attention. It's 9 o'clock. Class is dismissed. More research needed. Glad to be here. Thank you so much.
Well, gave us a lot to think about. Thank you very much, David, for addressing us this evening. There are, as he indicated, there's just a lot that needs to be done. There are a lot of questions that need to be answered, and I'm sure you'll be around maybe to visit with people who have questions as the evening progresses. We're about finished. Remind you about the books in the other room. You can, if you want a book, you can help yourself and buy them and give someone like me or Clayman or somebody the money. If you didn't get a chance to pay for your dinner, why, please do so. And most of all, remember, if you have an interest in either the local tour or in possibly going to Europe in a year or two, let us know. We'll be taking names as soon as we finish up if there's any interest. We want to again thank the Whitestone Church for hosting us tonight. Thank you very much. You did an excellent job. Thank you all for coming. One other thing, the pictures are still showing, I think, over in the other room. You can take a look at those as well. And we'll see you all in 3 or 4 months when we have the annual meeting. Yes.
I forgot to mention that Max is making a book about the trip, and if anybody's interested, they might mention it to him so he knows how many books to make.
Okay, Helen says that to mention that Max is making a book about the trip that'll have pictures and I don't know what all in it, so if you're interested, you might let us know about that too, so we can give him some indication of the number of books that he might need to make. Anything else that needs to come before this group? Okay, all right, so we'll have the annual meeting. It's been decided. We were waiting on a decision from the church. I couldn't announce it until just now. Kathy has the information, so it will be at the Halstead Church in March. So we're looking forward to that. Anything else? If not, thank you for coming and good night.